The item before me arrived in Vault 13, sealed within 3 reinforced containers, each bearing the stamp of multiple maritime authorities who, for reasons never recorded, refused to retain custody of it for longer than a single night. The containers held the written and mechanical remnants of a vessel known as the Orpheus, a mid-century research trawler that vanished somewhere in the North Atlantic in the year 1957. Its reappearance, decades later, has never been adequately explained. The Orpheus was found drifting without power several miles east of a commercial shipping lane. A passing cargo carrier first sighted the hull through morning haze and reported it as a derelict, assuming at a glance that the vessel had suffered years of weathering. When a boarding team finally stepped onto the deck, they discovered something far stranger. The Orpheus looked as though it had been deserted only hours before. Paint that should have flaked away long ago appeared intact. Brass fixtures showed only faint tarnish. The galley contained plates still set for a meal, the contents stiffening in the open air. A cup of coffee, long cold but entirely unspoiled, sat beside a half-burned cigarette resting in a clean glass ashtray. There were no signs of struggle or foul play. No blood, no footprints other than those of the salvage crew, and most notably, no crew of the Orpheus could be found anywhere aboard. Their lifeboats remained secured, their emergency equipment was untouched, their personal belongings were preserved exactly as if their owners intended to return momentarily. But the true irregularities lay within the recovered documentation. What follows in this file is a curated assembly of the ship's remaining records. The captain's logbook, several engineering and maintenance sheets, radio man transcripts, partial deck notes, and a small collection of reel-to-reel tapes retrieved from beneath the communications console. These materials were not aged as they should have been. Paper pages should have yellowed and cracked from salt exposure. Instead, they felt supple, almost recent. Ink that should have bled into illegibility preserved its lines with only minor fading. The audio tapes, expected to have degraded into useless fragments, retained clarity far beyond their generation. Our examination revealed further concerns. Many entries in the captain's log repeat dates or overlap events as if the same day were lived more than once. Engineering notes appear to reference procedures performed twice, with slight deviations. Some radioman transcripts list weather conditions that historical records show did not occur on the dates given. And several time-stamped recordings bear markings that do not correspond to any contemporary calendar system. In compiling this reconstruction, I have arranged the materials into the closest approximation of chronological order that the evidence allows. I caution the listener. The Orpheus did not drift in ordinary waters, nor did its crew move through time in a manner we can easily map. What follows is the most complete account of their final voyage. Let us begin. The earliest surviving materials from the Orpheus begin uneventfully, marked by the sort of meticulous record-keeping expected of a mid-century research trawler. Even in these stable opening days, however, there are hints of irregularities. Small details that would not seem important until the crew attempted to make sense of their final hours aboard. It is my role here only to arrange these fragments into the most coherent path possible. According to what remains of the captain's log, the Orpheus left Halifax on the 3rd of April, 1957, with a full complement of crew and a detailed itinerary provided by the institute sponsoring their survey. Their assignment was routine: collect sediment samples, update trawl line data, and gather baseline environmental readings over a stretch of the northern slope. The captain noted clear weather, a steady breeze, and a well-maintained ship. He wrote that the Orpheus handled smoothly after its recent refit, that the men were in good spirits, and that nothing on the horizon suggested the difficulties that would later define their voyage. The engineering sheets from that same day reinforced this impression. The chief engineer recorded clean pressure readings and a newly balanced drive. He remarked that the engine's rhythm was the best he had heard in years. But he also included a small notation, one that would later appear almost prophetic. At low power, he felt a faint vibration through the stern hull plating. At first, he attributed it to a minor imbalance in the propeller or a bit of fouling on the blades after the prior season. It was, in his estimation, nothing to concern himself about. He wrote only that he would monitor this vibration during the coming days. From the radio man's desk, the earliest surviving notes are typical transcripts of routine communications. His entries are neat, typed in clean lines with occasional margin notes made in fountain pen. Each afternoon, he logged brief exchanges with the coastal stations, reporting weather, location, and operational status. There is nothing in these early contacts that suggests any interference or anomaly, except one detail noted in his handwriting. During a second check-in, he believed he heard a faint tone under the static. He described it as a harmonic, something like the sound of a wet finger drawn around the rim of a glass. He dismissed it as atmospheric distortion, but he underlined the phrase once, suggesting the sound troubled him more than he admitted. Taken individually, none of these fragments are unusual, but together they form the first thin line of evidence pointing toward a subtle change in the sea around them. The second day's accounts show the Orpheus proceeding along its established route. Weather remained mild. The crew performed their standard duties. The captain wrote that the ship made excellent time and that all gear aboard remained functional. Additionally, he made an observation that seems irrelevant until considered in retrospect. The air felt unseasonably warm for the latitude. Several crew members had remarked the same during their night watch, though the log contains no indication that the temperature rise was abnormal enough to investigate further. The chief engineer, meanwhile, kept detailed notes on the engine's performance. On this second day, he reported that the hour meter, responsible for tracking the engine's cumulative running time, behaved unexpectedly. For a short period that morning, the meter did not advance. Then, upon his return in the afternoon check, it had leaped ahead by nearly 10 minutes. His entry reads, "Possible mechanical sticking. We'll watch closely." The wording is practical, but the underline beneath the phrase 10 minutes suggests he found the discrepancy unsettling. Further evidence emerges from the radio man's early tapes. While much of the material from these first days consists of standard check-ins, one tape, slightly warped but still intelligible, contains a brief glitch at the end of a routine transmission. It lasts only a second or two, but in that moment the radio man's voice is followed by a faint repetition of his final sentence, played back with a delay of less than a second. It is not a clean echo. It sounds as if someone else is repeating the words in a different timbre. Not an imitation, but something close enough to prompt concern. The radio man makes no mention of this event in his typed transcript, suggesting he did not notice it at the time. Only during analysis months after recovery could the repetition be heard clearly. The third day's materials reveal a turning point. Most of the surviving fragments from that morning describe the Orpheus entering a dense fog bank well before dawn. The crew had expected fog in some parts of the route, but not in the waters they were then traversing, and certainly not so early in the season. The captain described it as a sheet of white pressing close to the hull, limiting visibility to a short stretch of deck. Several crew members complained that sound seemed to travel strangely. A shout from the bow returned to them too clearly, as if someone in the fog had repeated it back. The captain, a man of practical temperament, dismissed these complaints as the unease that often accompanies low visibility at sea. But he noted in his log that the fog lingered longer than forecasts predicted, and that the wind did not appear to move it as it should. He recorded that the air felt unnaturally still. The crew described it differently. According to several brief personal notes found in the quarters, the kind crews often scribble as reminders, the fog felt dense as cloth and too quiet. It is in these fog-bound hours that the earliest signs of time irregularities emerge. The captain wrote that sunrise appeared dimmed, as if smoothed through a fine filter. He believed the sun rose later than expected. The ship's chronometer, however, showed correct time. In the margin, he added that his wristwatch and the deck clock disagreed by nearly 20 minutes, though both had been in perfect sync before departure. He called for a standard correction but did not consider the matter serious. The engineer's records show that the vibration previously noted became more pronounced during low engine speed. He described the sensation as a constant low shiver through the plating. Several tools placed on the workbench trembled, moving gradually toward the edge until retrieved. Still, he believed the cause to be mechanical. He reported tightening mountings and inspecting the stern tube, but found no clear fault. The radio man's notes from this day contain the first deliberate mention of interference. He marked a brief period in the afternoon where static noise fluctuated oddly, rising and falling in a pattern that did not match atmospheric conditions. Beneath these fluctuations, he once again heard the harmonic tone. This time he wrote, longer, sustained. He also attempted to record the tone, and although the original data is degraded, the recording does indeed contain a low, smooth resonance of unknown origin. It does not resemble any known equipment hum or feedback artifact. The tape analysis indicates the sound was recorded at a constant frequency consistent with the earlier description of a glass-like resonance. From this point, the materials begin to reflect a shift in the crew's perception of the surrounding waters. Several entries refer to the sea in strained language. One crew member jotted on a torn corner of scrap paper, "Swells are too regular, like breathing." Another note, unsigned but likely belonging to one of the deckhands, reads, "Waves come from the wrong direction." The captain, attempting to maintain order and professionalism in his documentation, wrote only that the water appears unnaturally smooth between swells. But even this restrained observation suggests he sensed something off. He ended the entry with a sentence that has been underlined twice. "The horizon is steady but feels incorrect." Moving into the fourth day, we find a marked shift in the character of the logs. The captain's language becomes more terse. He writes less about routine matters and more about attempts to make sense of inconsistencies. Most telling is his attempt to reconcile navigational data from the prior evening. He writes that the Orpheus traveled an estimated distance based on the hours the engine ran, yet the plotted coordinates indicate a greater distance traveled than the engine hours should permit. He initially suspected the chronometer, but after rechecking, found no errors. The engine hours, however, remained inconsistent. The engineer, upon reviewing the log sheets, confirmed that the engine had run slightly fewer hours than the distance would suggest. The phrasing he used in his notes, "recorded hours and expected hours diverge," is understated, but it marks a critical observation. The Orpheus seemed to be traveling further than its mechanisms indicated it should have. On this same day, a different kind of evidence appears, marked by a change in the radio man's behavior. His notes become more hurried, his handwriting less controlled. Several lines are crossed out, rewritten, then crossed out again. One entry stands out. He describes a transmission received late in the afternoon. The shape of the transcript suggests he believed he was speaking with one of the coastal stations. But upon replaying the tape, analysts found something irregular. The responding voice sounds remarkably similar to the captain's voice, but with subtle differences. The cadence is slightly slower. The tone carries a faint roughness, as though belonging to a person older than the captain at the time. The voice provided a weather update that did not match the current conditions and included mention of an approaching storm system that, according to historical records, did not exist. The radio man must have sensed something was wrong. His margin note reads, "Not our station, not a known voice. Do not report to crew until verified." Yet the captain's log for this day contains a brief reference to odd interference during afternoon communication, suggesting the radio man eventually brought the matter to his attention. This is also the first day a name appears in the crew's informal writings, the Quiet Meridian. The term surfaces in a small note pinned near the galley. It is unclear who coined it, but several logs begin to reference it soon afterward. It appears the crew was attempting to give a name to the strange stillness of the water and the persistent fog that refused to disperse. The captain used the term only once, in a private note not entered into the main logbook. A name for our present condition might help steady the men or might worsen nerves. That same day, we find one of the earliest documented time anomalies beyond the engine readings and chronometer differences. According to the captain's reconstruction of the day's events, they performed a midday depth sounding, logged the results, and proceeded with a routine trawl. But the engineering log includes a note that the trawl occurred nearly an hour earlier than the captain's account suggests. The radio man's transcript, meanwhile, shows a check-in at a time that conflicts with both of these entries. One of the crew left a personal record describing lunch at a moment no other logs referenced. None of these discrepancies would be remarkable on their own. Fatigue and miscommunication are common at sea. But, taken together, they reflect subtle slippage in the crew's shared timeline. On the evening of the fourth day, the crew attempted to take bearings under a sky that several described as too bright for the conditions. The stars appeared unusually sharp, according to the captain, as though drawn closer. Yet, the horizon remained obscured by fog. One of the deckhands wrote, "Feels like the sky is pressing down." Another scribbled, "We are higher than the sea, though the meaning is unclear." Fragments from a short crew meeting that evening appear in the captain's private notes. The men expressed concern about the strange conditions, but the captain maintained that weather anomalies sometimes arise in this part of the ocean. He directed them to remain focused on their duties and avoid speculation. However, his tone in the log suggests strain. He ends the entry with a line, "Navigation reliable but untrustworthy." The paradox is intentional, reflecting his growing sense that the instruments showed stability while his perception did not. It is during this night that the radio man recorded something troubling. His tape contained the harmonic tone once more, louder and more sustained. Over it, he captured a second, faint layer of sound that, after audio cleaning, appears to be the beginnings of a voice. Only a few syllables can be discerned. The voice does not match any crew member. It may simply be a product of distortion, but the radio man's margin note reads, "Not imagined, heard clearly." He did not transcribe the sound directly, but on the original tape one can hear a faint attempt at speech beneath the resonance. By the fifth day, the crew's notes show a deepening unease. The captain wrote that the horizon shifted unpredictably. No visible movement, simply a persistent sense that the line between sea and sky moved without cause. The engineer's logs show he increased the frequency of engine checks, believing mechanical instability might underlie the crew's growing disquiet. He found no fault. Instead, he found signs of reduced oil usage, something that should not occur under steady operation. He wrote, "Engine burns less fuel than expected, efficiency beyond designed limits." This was not meant as praise. The engineer understood machines, and when something behaved outside its specifications, it worried him. The radio man's records became erratic. His transcripts compress multiple contacts into shorter intervals. One sheet lists a check-in at a time that does not appear in any other log. Another sheet repeats a prior transcript nearly word for word, save for one change, a reference to a location they had not yet reached. It is possible he mistakenly duplicated a prior entry, but analysis suggests subtle differences in sentence structure. These changes may reflect real variations in the transmission, though this cannot be proven. Throughout these records, the fog persists. There is no note of improving visibility. The captain's log indicates that the fog held close to the ship for nearly 30 hours, thinning only briefly before returning. Crew members began marking days by the meals served, rather than by sunlight. Even these personal markers began to conflict. The final section of materials from the first phase of the voyage concerns a day that appears differently across the logs. According to the captain, the day passed as expected. According to the engineer, a long stretch of hours vanished. According to the radio man, the same afternoon transmission was sent twice. The captain's entry opens with a reference to an uneventful morning, yet his writing becomes hesitant near the middle of the page. He crossed out several lines before settling on a simple description of their location. But the coordinates he entered do not correspond to the plotted course. They appear instead to place the Orpheus well north of any location recorded earlier. He attempted to correct the entry, but the replacement coordinate still differs from the engineer's records by several miles. The engineer's notes for this day include a line he wrote 3 times. Engine hours repeat. 2 of the 3 lines are crossed out, but the meaning is clear. He believed the hour meter had looped or duplicated its count. He wrote that it showed the same value at 2 separate checks, which should not have been possible given his recorded running times. He also noted that the engine ran smoothly, almost too smoothly, as though operating under a different load than expected. The radio man's materials contain a transcript bearing the same timestamp as one from the previous day, with only the weather conditions changed. This entry is one of the earliest examples of log duplication. Analysts believe these inconsistencies mark the crossing into what the crew later called the Quiet Meridian. Near the end of this composite day, one of the crew wrote a short entry on the back of a maintenance form. Feels like days inside days. This note bears no timestamp and may have been written later, but its presence here suggests that several crew members felt temporal dislocation well before the captain acknowledged it. That night, the radio man recorded another transmission anomaly. When he contacted the station, he heard a delayed repetition of his own words, but not his voice. The tone was deeper, slightly more weathered. It repeated the final phrase he had spoken, but the echo added additional words not present in his original transmission. These words are unclear on the tape, but include a partial reference to a future date. He reported this anomaly to the captain privately. The captain's log for that night ends with, "Radio man reports inconsistency. Will revisit tomorrow. Need clear mind, crew restless." That is the final intact entry before the Orpheus began its descent into true distortion. The period that follows marks the Orpheus's transition from unease into a sustained unraveling of time, perception, and orientation. In the surviving materials, this shift becomes unmistakable. Though the logs remain coherent in their earliest pages, their structure begins to dissolve as the crew moves deeper into the region they came to call the Quiet Meridian. Events span inconsistent intervals, repeated entries appear in different handwriting, and sections of text seem overwritten by later additions without the earlier lines being erased. It is here in these anomalies that we see the crew transition from confusion to dread, and later to acceptance. To interpret this stage of their voyage, I draw from the captain's increasingly fragmented notes, the engineer's evolving technical logs, the radio man's more desperate transcripts, and the various personal reminders the crew left scattered in their quarters. The Orpheus did not descend suddenly. Rather, it slipped quietly, repeatedly, into a space where familiar rules no longer applied. The earliest clear indicator involves the navigational data recorded over several consecutive days. The captain attempted to maintain precise position logs, as was standard practice for a research vessel, and he dutifully plotted coordinates morning and evening. Yet his entries show that their calculated position did not change meaningfully over a span that, by the ship's clocks, exceeded 20 hours. The crew sailed under full power for much of that time, but the plotted points clustered within a tight radius, no wider than a few miles. Each new coordinate repeated a previous position with only minor variation. The captain did not initially acknowledge the impossibility of these readings. He reasoned that the fog had interfered with their ability to confirm celestial bearings, or that the chronometer had drifted. He attempted to compensate by verifying time with the engineer's watch and the radio man's desk clock. But all three devices disagreed by small, persistent margins, and their differences grew rather than diminished. One piece of evidence from this period comes from a single slip of paper taped beside the captain's desk. It reads, "If horizon holds steady, check bearings again before alerting crew." This note suggests he recognized that something was wrong, but sought to prevent panic. Yet across several logs, he references the horizon in language that hints more at a sensation than a measurement. For example, he writes that the horizon felt fixed, or that it remained where it should not. In contrast, a deckhand's note found in a pocket reads, "We keep walking toward the rail and nothing moves." This comment likely reflects the crew's shared perception that the sea appeared static while the Orpheus churned forward, giving the unsettling impression that they were powering into a motionless, unchanging view. The most difficult period to reconstruct is the interval covering what appears to be the 6th and 7th days of the voyage. During this time, the surviving logs disagree significantly. The captain describes a morning in which the fog briefly lifted, revealing a faint blue line of sky to the east. He wrote that the sight lifted morale, though only for a short while. He believed they had emerged from the worst of the weather and would soon resume their route. He does not describe any major anomalies during this interval. But the engineer's log for this same day contradicts the captain's recollection entirely. According to the engineer, the fog never lifted. Instead, he notes the air grew colder, the steel of the handrails gathering beads of moisture that did not fall, but clung to the metal in perfect spheres. He writes that visibility remained limited to a few dozen meters, and that he suspected the damp conditions would eventually corrode equipment if they lingered too long. He also records that the engine consumed less fuel than expected, despite running at a steady load. This reduction is significant. In one entry, he writes, "Consumption curve does not align with revolutions. Output suggests full engine hours, but gauges contradict this." Such a phenomenon defies normal engine behavior. If the ship had slowed without the crew noticing, that might explain the discrepancy. Yet the navigational logs show that, by the captain's account, they maintained their heading and speed exactly as planned. The radio man's notes add another layer. One transcript, time-stamped within this disputed window, includes a weather report he sent to the coastal station. The report describes clear skies and reduced winds, matching the captain's account. Yet, the radio man's handwritten note in the margin contradicts his own typed report. It reads, "I do not remember seeing sun today." These overlapping contradictions mark the point at which shared reality aboard the Orpheus began to fragment. The radio man's records from this stage are some of the most troubling. His transcripts show increasing interference during communications. Static rises in irregular pulses. The harmonic tone heard earlier grows stronger, at times overshadowing the radio man's own voice. He also begins to document anomalies that bear no natural explanation. One transcript records a transmission received from their own call sign. The voice that answered sounded like the captain, but not the captain they knew. The tone carried the weight of age, a slight rasp, and a measured cadence. The responding voice provided weather conditions that did not match the observed environment and cited a position that, according to the captain, they had not reached. The radio man noted that the voice sounded familiar but wrong, and speculated about an impersonation or cross-frequency reflection. Yet, the most unsettling line in the radio man's notes is this: "If this is a recording, who made it?" He circled this question 3 times. Later, he wrote, "Must not tell the crew until certain. Captain must verify." This suggests the radio man struggled to reconcile what he heard with the reality around him. Whether the captain ever heard the playback is unclear. We find no record of his response to this particular event. In another transcript, the radio man logs a second anomaly. After sending a routine position report, he heard his own words repeated back immediately, but the echo included an extra sentence he had not spoken. "Course maintained. You are still within the meridian." Those words do not appear in his initial transmission, nor do they match any known station protocol. The radio man scratched this entire transcript out, leaving it nearly illegible. Only after careful restoration could it be read. In the quarters and workspaces of the Orpheus, analysts discovered several personal notes that shed light on how the crew's perceptions grew increasingly unreliable. One note, unsigned and written in pencil on a torn fragment of packing paper, reads, saw Finn on deck at dawn, ate lunch with him later, but he missed roll call. Was he there? Finn was one of the deckhands. His name appears inconsistently in the logs from this phase. In some records, he is present and active. In others, he is not mentioned at all. One page of the crew manifest lists his bunk as occupied. Another, written in a different hand, lists it as vacant. It is possible these inconsistencies reflect simple oversight, but given the other temporal distortions at play, it may suggest something more. Another note from this period mentions two crew members arguing about whether a certain day had already occurred. One believed they were repeating tasks performed the previous morning. The other insisted it was a new day. The captain intervened and dismissed the disagreement, attributing it to fatigue and stress. But his later logs reflect uncertainty. In one margin notation, he writes, "Unclear when some events occurred. Next time must confirm hours with engineer." This notation appears twice, suggesting the captain may have reviewed his earlier notes and repeated the instruction without realizing he had written it before. The engineer's logs form a consistent thread throughout this phase, even as the world around him began to slip. His technical observations carry a precision the others lacked. It is through his entries that we understand how the ship's machinery began to defy normal operation. He reports that the engine behaved as though responding to commands before he issued them. He describes checking gauges only to find they had already moved to the values he intended to set moments later. At first, he suspected electrical faults or sensor drift, but as the logs progress, his tone shifts from clinical to unsettled. One particularly telling entry reads, "Engine hours repeated today. Found prior values recorded on new sheet. Either error or hours looping." In another, he writes, "Fuel consumption inconsistent with revolutions. Running efficiently beyond design. Impossible." He uses the word impossible sparingly. When he does, it suggests he reached a point beyond technical explanation. In his final entry from this period, he writes, "Feels like engine runs in more than one day at once. This statement is not a technical description, but a visceral impression. It reveals the engineer's experience of time diverging from the instruments he monitored. As the anomalies accumulated, the captain made his first recorded attempt to remove the Orpheus from the region. He ordered a complete change of bearing, intending to retrace their path and leave the fog behind. According to his logs, the ship ran under full power for several hours. The engineer's notes confirm that the engine was brought to higher speed and fuel consumption briefly rose to expected levels. Yet, despite this effort, their evening coordinate matched one logged 2 days earlier. There is no evidence the Orpheus moved at all during this interval, even though both the captain and the engineer believed they had steamed at full power. The sea's appearance did not change. The fog surrounding the ship did not thin. No shore stations responded to their transmissions. In the captain's notes from that evening, he writes, "We must have made some mistake. Must try again tomorrow." Beneath this line, he adds a caution: crew must remain focused. But the engineer's log tells a different story. He wrote, tried to leave, did not leave. And below that, something holds us, not mechanical. Following this failed attempt, the logs begin to display more overt signs of temporal disruption. Events appear to repeat. Several logs reference identical conditions at the same time on different days. The captain noted that the sky maintained an unnatural brightness, as though the sun were filtered through a thin layer of frost. The radio man described hearing the same segment of static twice within minutes, each time accompanied by the harmonic tone. Crew members independently began mentioning the phrase, the Quiet Meridian, though no one log explains who first coined the term. It appears in different handwriting styles across multiple documents. The phrase suggests an attempt to impose meaning on their experience, to give structure to the formlessness around them. One crew member scrawled, "We are stuck between times." Another wrote, "The sea is not behaving. The sky is too still. Something is wrong." The captain attempted to maintain calm by instructing the crew to focus on their duties and avoid speculation. But his own logs reflect increasing uncertainty. In one entry he writes, "Time uncertain, must rely on instruments." In another, only a few pages later, he writes, "Instruments uncertain, must rely on senses." This contradiction captures the essence of their descent. Nothing could be trusted, not the clocks, not the horizon, not their own recollection of events. One of the most significant anomalies occurs in the radio man's logs. He records receiving a transmission from their own call sign, but the timestamp on the incoming message indicated a date decades beyond their current year. The voice on the line sounded unmistakably like the captain, but older with a slight tremble. The message described the Orpheus as a derelict found drifting with no crew aboard. This description matches the condition in which the Orpheus was recovered many years later. The radio man wrote in larger, uneven handwriting, "This cannot be." Later, he writes, "We received our own future." The captain's logs contain no mention of this event. It is unclear whether the radio man shared it with him or kept it to himself. In this stage, the crew manifest begins to shift unpredictably. Names appear and disappear across different records. One crew member appears in the engineer's log, but not in the captain's. The radio man references a deckhand not listed in the manifest at all. Analysts believe these discrepancies reflect either extreme confusion or genuine temporal distortion. There is no definitive evidence supporting either conclusion. One fragmentary note found near the crew quarters reads, "20 of us now, thought 18 or 17. The original manifest indicates a crew of 21. By the time of the Orpheus's recovery, no bodies were found aboard. After several days of disjointed logs, the captain ordered a second attempt to escape the Quiet Meridian. This time, he proposed a multi-hour continuous run at maximum safe speed, with all non-essential systems powered down. The engineer's logs indicate preparations for high-speed transit, including checks of coolant lines and reinforcement of fittings. The radio man prepared to monitor communications for signs of interference. Several notes compiled by the crew suggest anticipation and anxiety. One read, "If this does not work, what then?" Another read, "Feels like we have already done this." The captain's log for the day of the attempt is fragmented. He describes the start of the run, the engine at full power, and the crew tense but hopeful. He writes, "We are moving, must be," but later lines contradict this. "Not moving, sea unchanged, fog unchanged." The engineer's log confirms the engine ran at high revolutions for an extended period, but he notes fuel consumption did not rise as expected. He writes, "Output greater than intake, impossible." He circles the word impossible. The radio man's transcripts from this run show multiple identical position reports, all with the same text and same timestamp, as though the same moment repeated. During the escape attempt, the radio man captured another anomaly. A transmission from their own frequency arrived with clarity. It repeated a directive. "You cannot steam out. You must step out." The voice resembled the captain's, but with the same aged qualities as previous anomalous transmissions. The radio man noted that this message repeated twice in the same minute, identically each time. There is no natural explanation for such a phenomenon. The captain's logs make no direct reference to this message, suggesting either he did not hear it or chose not to record it. Following the failed attempt, the tone across the logs changes. The captain stops referencing navigational goals. The engineer begins writing less about the engine and more about his own experience of time. The radio man's notes become erratic, as though written by someone unsure which hours belonged where. A final note in this phase comes from the captain. It reads, "We have entered a place where time folds, cannot leave by sea, must consider alternatives." This final philosophical shift marks the transition into the next phase of their ordeal, where the crew begins to understand that the only path forward might involve abandoning the Orpheus entirely. The surviving records from the latter stage of the Orpheus's disappearance are the most fragmented and the most disturbing. They bear the greatest degree of temporal distortion, the deepest internal contradictions, and the clearest signs that the ship and its crew no longer shared a single, continuous reality. In these pages and tapes, we see the Orpheus beginning to understand the nature of the place it had drifted into, though even understanding brought no resolution. Their writings and recordings suggest not a sudden collapse, but a gradual surrender to a pattern they had already repeated many times without remembering. By the time the final entries were made, the logs had become a collage of overlapping days, converging perceptions, and moments that repeated without warning. Piecing together the crew's experiences requires navigating entries that contradict themselves within the same paragraph, or appear to be written by someone who had not yet lived the events described in earlier sections. These inconsistencies are exactly what define the Orpheus's final days. They are evidence not of failure in documentation, but of the breakdown of the linear sequence the crew had once trusted. The earliest surviving materials from this phase indicate that the crew had begun to lose confidence in the tools and measurements that once guided their work. The captain's log from this period contains several sweeping lines of text written over the faint impressions of earlier entries. It seems he reused the same pages to correct his prior understanding of events, but the original ink remains faintly visible beneath the newer writing. In places, analysts found as many as 3 layers of overlapping entries, none of which align entirely with one another. The captain appears to have rewritten the same day multiple times, each time presenting a different version of what occurred. In one of these layers, he describes a morning with calm weather and improved visibility. He writes that the fog had thinned and that the crew took comfort in the brief clarity. But only a few lines later, in the overwritten text beneath, he writes that the fog had been dense enough to obscure the bow from the wheelhouse, and that no one aboard had seen the sun for days. Neither account can be verified, though both appear to have been believed by the captain at the moment of their writing. A separate fragment from this same period contains the captain's frustrated attempt to reconcile the ship's logs. He writes, "These entries do not belong to the same day. They should, but they do not. I must track our sequence more carefully." He then attempts to redraw the ship's timeline in the margins, but the resulting chart is incoherent. Lines loop backwards, dates are repeated or crossed out. A single arrow seems to indicate forward movement, but it returns to a point earlier in the sequence with no explanation. It is not the work of a man confused by stress alone. Rather, it resembles the attempt of someone trying to map a path that was no longer linear. The engineer's notes from this period provide another lens through which to understand the deepening distortions. His handwriting, typically neat and concise, becomes erratic. He reports finding engine hours duplicated or reversed. On one sheet he writes, "Engine ran 6 hours today." Directly beneath this he writes, "Engine did not run at all today." Both statements appear in the same ink and same handwriting. A later entry reads, "Hours erase themselves." Yet his comments about the machinery's behavior remain technically consistent. He notes that pressure values stayed within expected ranges, that fuel combustion remained stable, and that temperature readings were normal. In his view, the engine was performing better than it had in years, but the temporal markers surrounding its operation were unreliable. One of the most unsettling entries from this stage comes from a partial engineering sheet, where he remarks that the tools on his bench were found in a configuration he did not recall arranging. He describes seeing a wrench placed with careful precision atop a rag, though he remembered setting it down somewhere else entirely. He writes, "The tool feels warm. I have no memory of touching it." It is unclear whether he believed the tool had been moved by someone else or by some anomaly in his perception of time. Later, in the same sheet, he writes, "Feels like I am always arriving, never leaving." He repeats this phrase twice on the page. The radio man's transcripts from this period reveal an escalating pattern of echoes and repeated transmissions. He notes receiving a position report he believed he had sent earlier in the day, but the timestamp printed by the machine indicated it was incoming rather than outgoing. He writes, "Received my own words today. Should be impossible." He then attempts to record the discrepancy, but his handwriting deteriorates. On the tape itself, one can hear the faint edge of his breathing, and then his voice reading the position report aloud. Moments later, a second voice repeats the same information, matching his inflection but with slight changes in cadence, as though spoken by someone familiar with him, but not entirely the same person. In another tape from this period, the radio man attempts to call the coastal station at regular intervals, but he receives no reply. Static dominates the line for long stretches. Eventually, a voice responds. Analysts believe this was another echo from the temporal distortion surrounding the ship. The voice resembles the captain's but carries qualities of age and fatigue that do not match the period of the voyage. The voice warns, "Stay inside the route. Do not turn." When the radio man asks for identification, the voice does not answer directly. Instead, it states, "You are approaching the moment again." The meaning of this message remains unknown. The crew's personal notes from this time provide scattered insight into their psychological state. One crew member wrote, "I saw a man on the stern, but no one else saw him." Another wrote, "We have done this twice already." Yet another wrote, "Are we repeating these days?" These notes suggest an emerging awareness among the crew that they may have been experiencing some form of temporal recursion. The captain's behavior also appears to have changed significantly. Earlier in the voyage, he attempted to maintain order and relied on rational explanations. But his later logs show an increasing willingness to consider non-mechanical causes for their predicament. He writes, "The sea is holding us, not by force, but by repetition." He then adds, "Something in the fog wants us to remain." It is not clear whether he believed this literally or metaphorically. In one long, overwritten entry, the captain describes walking the length of the deck and noticing that the same sequence of sounds repeated every few minutes. He mentions the engine's hum rising and falling in a consistent pattern, the creaking of the hull in the same rhythm, and the faint splash of water hitting the side of the ship in identical intervals. He writes, "We are in a loop. The world is looping." He then attempts to test this theory by marking the passage of time manually, but his notes indicate confusion. He writes, "Marked this minute. When I looked again, it was earlier, not later." The engineer attempted a similar experiment by scratching tally marks on a beam near his workbench. However, his tallies appear inconsistent. Some are scratched deeply, others faintly. In one place, a series of tallies appears to have been partially erased, leaving only faint impressions. He writes, "I do not remember removing them." Another layer of writing appears beneath his own, though analysts could not determine when the underlying marks were made. Some ink analysis suggests they may have been written at a time that does not correspond to any known phase of the voyage, though this cannot be proven. One of the most puzzling artifacts from this stage is a sheet of paper bearing the engineer's handwriting on one half and the captain's handwriting on the other. The engineer writes, "We must measure from within." The captain writes, "We must measure from beyond." Both phrases appear on the same sheet, but analysts could not determine whether they were written consecutively or at different times. The radio man's tapes from this period include several instances of overlapping transmissions. In one case, his own voice is heard speaking a message, followed by a second voice speaking the same message but altering the final detail. The initial transmission ends with "position unchanged," while the echoing voice ends with "position returns." When played repeatedly, analysts noted that the second voice sounded slightly slowed, as though recorded at a different speed. Yet, neither tape recorder aboard the Orpheus was capable of such an effect under normal operation. The crew's final attempt to break free from the Quiet Meridian appears in a bundle of documents left near the captain's desk. The plan involved a coordinated effort to alter their course dramatically, running the engine at maximum safe output for several hours, and manually adjusting their navigational instruments to compensate for any perceived distortions. The captain believed that a strong change in direction, coupled with a prolonged surge of forward motion, might allow them to escape the region. The engineer's logs confirm extensive engine checks prior to this attempt. He writes, "Systems ready, full revolutions planned, must maintain steady output." His handwriting is steadier here, suggesting a brief return to clarity. The radio man prepared to monitor transmissions carefully during the effort, hoping to catch any indication that they were approaching the edge of the distortions. Several crew notes express hope that the attempt would succeed. The logs describing this effort are among the most fragmented in the entire archive. The captain describes the ship surging forward under full power, but only a few sentences later, he writes that the sea did not change in appearance. The fog remained thick. The horizon remained immobile, he writes, moving with no motion, speed without distance. These contradictory statements appear in the same entry. The engineer's notes indicate that the engine performed flawlessly during this attempt. He describes pressure rising as expected and fuel consumption increasing. Yet he also notes that after the run, the fuel levels showed little change. He writes, "Burned fuel, not burned." It is unclear what he meant by this. The radio man's transcripts contain several repeated position reports. All appear to have the same timestamp. It is as though he sent the same report multiple times, or as though multiple versions of the same moment were recorded on the tape. One of these position reports includes a faint echo of the radio man's own voice saying, "You will not break the meridian." The culmination of this effort appears in a short note from the captain. It reads, "We did not escape." Beneath this he writes, "We must find another way." In the final phase of their ordeal, the surviving logs indicate a profound shift in the crew's understanding of their situation. The captain's logs become philosophical. He writes, "We are not sailing through the meridian. We are held within it." He then writes, "It repeats to contain us." Whether this represents a metaphor or a literal interpretation of their experience is unclear, but it marks a turning point. The engineer's notes from this phase reveal reflections on the nature of time. He writes, "Hours do not progress, they return." In another entry, he writes, "Engine runs before I start it." His technical observations are interwoven with existential concerns. The radio man's tapes from this period are marked by longer stretches of silence. When he speaks, his voice carries a heavy fatigue. He describes hearing voices that seem to come from different versions of the ship. He writes, "I heard them again, not echoes." He also records a message from the phenomena he believed were manipulating the region. The transcript reads, "You must leave the vessel." Whether this was an actual transmission or a hallucination is impossible to determine. The crew's personal notes show mounting despair. Some notes describe fear of repeating days indefinitely. Others express a desire to leave the ship entirely. One note reads, "Better to dive than remain." Another reads, "The sea is not real here." Analysts cannot confirm who wrote these notes. The captain appears to have considered a radical solution. In his final coherent entries, he writes, "We must abandon the Orpheus." He suggests that the ship itself may anchor them within the distortions, acting as a fixed point around which the temporal patterns organize. He writes, "The ship holds us. Without it, we may slip free." This idea appears to have grown from repeated evidence in the logs, suggesting that moments aboard the ship were tied to the vessel's own structure. His final plan, reconstructed from scattered notes, involved gathering the crew on the deck at a moment when the harmonic tone beneath the ship was strongest. The captain believed this moment represented a point of alignment between their reality and the one beyond. He proposed that stepping into the water during this alignment might allow them to escape the loop. There is no record of him discussing the potential dangers of such an action, though he must have understood the risks. The engineer prepared the ship for abandonment by shutting down systems and securing equipment. He writes, "Engine final check complete." His final entry reads, "Vibration continues with engine off." This suggests the harmonic tone that had followed them throughout the journey was not mechanical. The radio man's final tape is incomplete. It begins with him describing the tone rising beneath the hull. He says, "This is the moment." He then pauses and one can hear his slow breathing. He says, "Goodbye to whoever hears this." The tape ends abruptly. The final physical evidence suggests the crew gathered on deck as planned. The life vests were removed from their storage compartments. Several boot marks appear near the railing. One partial deck log shows a final muster recorded, though no names are listed. A final note scratched into a bulkhead near the bow reads, "It was not drowning." The meaning of this phrase remains unknown. When the Orpheus was eventually recovered decades later, the ship appeared as though abandoned only hours before. No bodies were found. No crew returned to claim the vessel. The ship's clocks, though stopped, were all synchronized to the moment of its recovery. The engine was found slightly warm, suggesting recent operation, despite the engineer's final entry indicating a complete shutdown. These final details suggest the Orpheus passed through a moment of release, emerging into normal waters without its crew. What happened to the men remains a mystery, though their final actions suggest they believed stepping into the sea during that moment of alignment would free them from the Meridian's grasp. The materials collected from the Orpheus, once arranged and examined, defy any conventional explanation. Their pages resist the natural processes of time. Their ink remains sharper than it should be. Even the tapes, which by all rights should have degraded into brittle ribbons, play with clarity beyond what their age allows. In each artifact, there is an impression, faint but persistent, that they do not entirely belong to the decades between their disappearance and recovery. The logbooks themselves display signs of interference that cannot be reconciled with the physical world as we understand it. Ink analyses show writing deposited in layers that do not follow chronological order. Entries believed to have been written early in the voyage lie atop impressions from far later days. In several places, the strokes shimmer faintly under magnification, as though responding to multiple time periods at once. Efforts to carbon date the paper yielded results so inconsistent that the procedure had to be halted. Some pages registered as older than the Orpheus herself, others as though they had been penned mere months before the vessel was found. The engineering documents show similar irregularities. The graphite used in the annotations does not match any single era. In one sheet, the pencil marks appear old and brittle. In another, the pressure of the writing seems fresh, as though the engineer stepped away only moments before the salvagers arrived. The patterns do not follow any reasonable progression. It is as if the logs were both preserved and altered repeatedly, the entries shifting to reflect events that had already happened, or would happen, or were happening again, in ways the crew could not fully comprehend. The radio man's tapes present a different problem. Each reel is marked with the style of labeling common to the time of the Orpheus's departure. Yet, the magnetic patterns in several recordings show distortions inconsistent with the technology of that era. When these tapes are played, faint harmonics surface, tones that do not correlate to any equipment aboard the ship. In several recordings, analysts have identified layered frequencies spaced too perfectly to be random. Some researchers have suggested these tones represent reflections of the ship's own transmissions caught within the temporal distortions of the Meridian, returning to the vessel long after or long before they were first recorded. There are also moments of human presence preserved in these tapes that cannot be accounted for. In one instance, a soft exhalation precedes a line of speech that never appears in any log. In another, a whisper overlays the radio man's voice, producing a second message that seems to come from someone standing very near him, though no one else was recorded in the communications room on that day. These anomalies do not appear in every playback. They are unpredictable. Some archivists reported hearing faint voices that others could not verify, suggesting either subtle degradation or a deeper issue with the tape's origins. The navigational records found aboard the Orpheus remain equally troubling. Their charts follow routes that diverge from any known path, and certain bearings appear twice in slightly different handwritings. One chart contains a coordinate that analysts have never been able to map. It lies in a region that, according to historical oceanographic surveys, contains no documented anomalies. Yet when the captain drew that point, he circled it twice and wrote a note that simply reads, "Here again." Whether he meant they had reached that point before or were destined to reach it repeatedly cannot be determined. Several pages of the crew manifest show similar signs of shifting identity. Names appear in one version and vanish in another. In one list, a deckhand is present who does not appear in any other documentation. In another list, the total count of crew members is one greater than the original manifest. These variations are not the result of poor record keeping. They appear intentional, as though the ship itself altered the lists to reflect different states of the voyage. The conditions in which the Orpheus was recovered add further complexity. When the salvage team boarded, they found the ship in disquieting order. Meals sat half-eaten, tools rested in neat arrangements, journals lay open to fresh pages with ink not yet smudged. The engine was warm to the touch. Yet the ship had been missing for decades, drifting unseen across an ocean heavily trafficked by commercial vessels. No one reported sightings during the years of its absence. The ship appears to have remained just outside the visible world until the moment it re-entered, clean and intact, as though delivered carefully back into familiar waters. Several items recovered from the vessel bear a final irregularity worth noting. A handful of papers found near the radio man's console show faint impressions of words that do not appear in any visible ink. Under magnification, these indentations resemble emergency messages, calls for help, warnings not to return, and what appears to be a final echo of the radio man's voice. A forensic specialist reported hearing a faint tone during examination, a low resonance similar to those described in the logs. The specialist believed it was a fault in his equipment. Subsequent inspections revealed nothing. Still, he refused to continue work on the artifacts. The Orpheus and its contents have now been stored within the restricted collections of Vault 13, where they remain sealed under controlled conditions. Their materials continue to display irregularities that should not be possible. Pages curl and uncurl unpredictably. Ink darkens or fades without environmental cause. On rare occasions, the ship's logbook appears to shift slightly in weight, though its pages remain sealed within archival housing. The fate of the crew, though never documented directly, may be reflected in their final decision. Every piece of evidence suggests they believed their escape required abandoning the ship during a moment of alignment within the Quiet Meridian. Their absence may indicate success, or it may indicate something else entirely. We can only catalog what they left behind and listen closely to what remains. This file is now sealed. This concludes the recovered file. May future listeners take caution in its implications. The Archivist, Vault 13.